But
Could I hit your PowerPoint?
is it okay if I stay seating? All right. So welcome, everyone. My partner, Larry Budner, here is also a retired professor from Rhode Island College. And so we go back a long way, back to 1973. And he's been a wonderful support in everything I do. I spent the last 7 years, well, really through 2024, interviewing using individual and focus group interview techniques, 9 different groups of refugees who had made the choice and were facilitated to resettle in Canada. So my talk today will be on the challenges of resettlement and integration into a new society. And integration I use with quote marks because we really don't in Canada think in terms of you come to Canada and you let go of your previous cultural values and identity, but that you find a way to hold on to whatever of that you wish and at the same time become a Canadian. I was born in Hamilton, Ontario in 1941, 1 week after the attack of the Japanese on Pearl Harbor. Everybody knows about that, right? And my father was drafted immediately into the Canadian Army. He was 23, my mother was 20, and I met him when I was 5. He left when I was 2 months old. And I grew up in an army camp near Hamilton called Hagersville Army Camp, which actually had been used for training pilots from all over Europe, all the allies and all over Canada, the U.S., at the request of the Prime Minister of England at the time, negotiated with the Prime Minister of Canada. At the end of the war, that airplane training school was transferred into an army base, and all the machines and equipment from the war came back, and they used the runways from the Air Force days to store all those trucks, tanks, would you believe it or not, snowmobiles, all kinds of equipment. And that's what I played on as a child. My friends and I would go out to the runways and climb into 10-ton mags, open the ropes and climb inside, make forts, try to find a way to get into the snowmobiles, which we never did. And I grew up there from age 5 until age 12 when we were posted to Victoria and then Vancouver and then finally to Washington, D.C. But in those days in the army camp, you would think maybe I would become a militaristic person. Instead, it had the opposite effect. I grew up watching over on the runway about 1/8 of a mile from our barracks, flamethrowers being tested. Have you ever seen a flamethrower? They're terrifying. It's what was used in Vietnam and many other places that we've waged war. And I grew up seeing military people and families like ours move all over the place at the whim of the government. And I became a very deep pacifist. So one reason I did this kind of work is because I was moved to Washington, D.C. as a permanent resident when I was 16, had my fingers printed and my IDs created. And I ended up marrying an American, having kids, and then divorcing and never being able to leave the country. So I have stayed in the U.S. since 1958, essentially against my will, except for 1 year, my freshman year at UBC in Vancouver. And so in a sense, I was not a refugee, I was an immigrant, but I was a forced immigrant. It wasn't a choice I would have made. It was done when I was a minor child. And forget that, because I went on to do all kinds of other things in my life. But as I got older, I started thinking about what really is important right now in the world, and I believe it's the refugee crisis. There are millions of people wandering around this planet who can't find a home, who will never be processed properly by the United Nations High Commission for Refugees because they're overloaded, underfunded, and there are all kinds of blocks and delays, and that's not right. Many countries are responsible for this situation, and I felt I had to do something. And that's why in 2017, I got in my car and started driving across my country, Canada. I am a dual citizen by various coincidences, but I drove out to first southern British Columbia to speak with Doukhobor people. Doukhobor means spirit wrestlers. And these folks were absolutely oppressed. They were refugees in Russia, and they were brought to Canada 1899 to 1903 by Leo Tolstoy and the Quakers and the Canadian government and Queen Victoria. And that is a story in itself. And they are their own book that's coming out next year called People of Peace, even though they ended up being listed by the Canadian government as the second most active terrorist group in Canada, second only to the EFLQ in Quebec. So that's a story apart, but they are the first chapter in Refugee Pathways to Freedom, which I'm donating to your resource center. Also, journeyed to Kitchener-Waterloo and interviewed Rohingya. I went to Lethbridge, Alberta to interview the Nepali-speaking Bhutanese, or Lhotshampa, and to London, Ontario to interview the Kurds who were trapped in northern Syria and terribly attacked and really debased and terrorized by ISIS there. And then this other book that I brought to show you, which will also be in your resource center, Refugee Pathways to Peace, which includes, I think it went the wrong way. What happened there? Yeah, Syrians also very much involved with being terrorized by the ISIS bands. The Congolese from the Democratic Republic of Congo and Liberians, both of whom I interviewed in Hamilton, Ontario, as well as in London. And Ukrainians in London, Ontario, I was able to interview Ukrainian women and their teenage boys and their fathers 10 days after they arrived in Canada. So the whole experience was very fresh and new. And of course, you may remember when the war started, the Ukrainian government said that any male over 18 or under 60 had to stay and fight. And so these were mostly professional women, highly educated, fairly well-off women who were able to get their fathers and their teenage boys out into Poland and then to Canada. And then I interviewed the Vietnamese, both people in Ottawa, who came in the late 70s, early 80s to Canada after being, I would say, there's not even a word for what the Vietnamese boat people went through. They had to take little boats down little streams and tiny rivers to get to the Mekong River, to get to the Gulf of Thailand, to, small boat to bigger boats, and to escape after the Vietnam War was won essentially by the North, and the Southern Vietnamese were then incredibly badly treated. The men were sent to so-called re-education camps in North Vietnam with no seeds, no wood, no nothing. They had to build huts out of tree limbs and try to find a way to eat so that they could come to true communist thinking. That was the effort, that was the idea. And eventually they started leaving. And I'll talk more about them in a minute. So those are the 5 in Refugee Pathways to Peace. But all along, I've had to think about I've been forced to think about the future of the United Nations High Commission for Refugees, the future of integration and resettlement policies in individual countries. I've been forced to think about how refugee camps are run, and how the experience in refugee camps has affected the capacity, ability, well-being of refugees, newcomers, once they hit this shore, to be able to merge into this society, or anyone. So I focus on Canada because I know Canada best. That experience in the refugee camp can be debilitating, demoralizing, cost you gaps of years in your life before you come to settle in another country. And it's very damaging and humiliating in many cases. Now, I'm not saying there aren't good things that happen in refugee camps and that many groups and countries don't do a great job in their own way. But the people I talked to across 9 refugee groups are very clear that what happened in the camps did not prepare them to resettle into a country like Canada or Germany or France or US or Australia. For example, the Bhutanese, and that's the one coming out next year for just about the Doukhobors. The Nepali-speaking Bhutanese, I'll call them the Lhotshampa. For example, in 1907, Bhutan was created by England and a king was appointed. And the king said, but we're Himalayans. We're northern Bhutanese, the northern part of what this new country is called. And the king asked, respectfully, the people of the southern part of Bhutan to, the part of Nepal where they were farmers, to come to the southern part of Bhutan and be farmers and raise grain, grow grain, be the breadbasket for this new country, which eventually had an almost 100% Buddhist government. So they were there, people came from Nepal, they were there for 4 generations. By 1981, the Bhutanese government had decided that it wanted everybody in Bhutan to be Buddhist, to wear Buddhist clothing, to wear Bhutanese clothing, to speak Bhutanese language. And the Lhotshampa in the south, who were really Nepalese by heritage and culture and language, said, no, we don't want to do that. And I'll talk more about that a little bit later, but their experience led me to think about new concepts, one of which was the persecution spiral. Another is strategic disenfranchisement, and the other 2 we'll talk about in a while too. But what happened was they said no. And when they said, no, we're not going to do all those wonderful things, they're farmers, the government took everybody's white card away in 1981 and gave them back only to Buddhists, not to Hindus, not to Muslims. And so the Bhutanese, the Nepali-speaking Bhutanese farmers were suddenly, they suddenly lost their citizenship. They suddenly became not only disenfranchised, but stateless, and they protested. They tried to get back to India. Some of them fled, and India said, we don't want you. They went back to Nepal, and the Nepalese government said, you're not Nepalese, you're Bhutanese. And so they were put in camps for 24 years. Canada and the U.S. finally took them, I don't know, 2007 or something. They had been in those camps for 24 years. So back to the point I started to make, which was being in a refugee camp is debilitating, demoralizing, dehumanizing. Children who were babies born at the beginning of that sojourn came to Canada when they were 24 years old. Very little education, no job skills, because you're not allowed to work on the economy. They have to work only in camp for each other if they can, to get more money for more food. All the refugees I interviewed talked about insufficient food and insufficient education, insufficient healthcare, you name it. And they were, for males who were like in their 60s, who were used to at least being able to do something as farmers to support their families, they were totally ruined. They'd come here at 84, or men who were 40s would come here at 64. So the elderly Lhotshampa had very high suicide rates in Alberta. They had, the refugee workers there said they had never seen rates among men so high for suicide and depression. And so we think of refugees, I was thinking of refugees, well, they spend a year or two until they're officially resettled somewhere. No, some of them I interviewed were 5, 10, 8 years, 12 years, maybe even going from camp to camp to an urban situation, such as in Lebanon, and high-rise buildings in admitted slums, and then being sent over to Jordan to get into a proper refugee camp. So, you know, it made me think I have to do something, and these books are the product of that. And my next goal will be to talk about refugee children in camps not receiving proper education. It's a violation of their human rights. So I want to just frame this all for a second in the Declaration of Human Rights, Universal Human Rights, 1948, 1949. It was signed in by most countries in the world, and that includes the right to shelter, food, education, healthcare, so forth. Speak right, you know, to have a voice. That didn't say enough, didn't specifically address refugees, people in flight. And so then the next thing was the late 50s, I think, the Convention on the Rights of the Refugee mentioned all those things, talked about a little bit more about refugee children. They still weren't getting educated in the camps or anywhere, and especially girls. And so then there was the sequel to the Convention on the Rights of the Child. It's all in these books. Don't ask me to remember them all. But now refugee children are specifically named as having the right to education, and it hasn't done any good. That's been since, I think, 2009. There was another meeting and another paper output. So the other two concepts came really more from the Vietnamese and a couple of other groups, strategic escape and strategic resettlement, because what I always thought in my mind, you know, seeing what I see on TV, you see people fleeing, there's a war, people are being shot at, you run. But that's only the last part of the story. What I heard across 9 groups was things were getting worse. Things were getting even worse. We're in this hot spot. It's next door to us. We're near, but we're not in it. It shifted over to our place. So we're going to go to another place that isn't a hot spot. This is Congo, very similar pattern there and as in other countries. And then the next thing you know, the whole place is a hot spot and you have to get out. But there are these preliminary stages in most cases. Certainly for Ukraine, there were bombs and you ran. There wasn't very much time to think about it. But even the Ukrainian women talked about the fact that they had hours, days, maybe a couple of days to go over this with their family. And in Ukraine, it seemed to be the husbands, the males, the fathers, the partners said, you have to leave and take the children. You have to go. I didn't hear that from any other group. I heard other groups, it was because of that 16 to 80 male thing would be recruited. there wasn't a heck of a lot of time to discuss it because Kiev was being bombed brutally in those first few weeks, months. And so a lot of the women said they didn't want to leave, but their husbands really pressured them to do so and take the kids. So they did. And that's another story. And strategic resettlement is a concept that I came to because I heard people saying we were on the social media. People in Myanmar, the Rohingya, for example, who are mostly Muslim, they heard of the government military coming to various villages, burning homes out, cutting the stomach open of pregnant women and ripping the babies out in front of little children. Some of the interviews saw these things with their own eyes. And they used social media, especially the phone, for phone calls or getting on whatever sites they use, to contact people in other villages. You have to flee now because this is what happened in our village. Head for Bangladesh, go to the River Neff, cross the River Neff into Bangladesh. And also for organizing counter protests, counter militia groups to fight against the government. I also heard stories about people, once they get to Canada, and they've been destined to, let's say, Halifax. That was true for the Lhotshampa. They didn't like it there. One woman talked about how she almost burned the motel down because she didn't know how to turn off the oven, and it was gas. And she did the wrong thing and it blew up. And she said, I almost killed all the people in the motel. So what they did was they used their cell phones to call Lhotshampa, who had been destined to Lethbridge, Alberta. And they worked with the Canadian government locally in Halifax to get them redestined, which was a new word I'd never heard, redestination, to go to the place where other Lhotshampa were, and they would learn from those who had been there for a while, a year or two, how to navigate the whole resettlement process and how to feel comfortable and have a new home. So I'm a sociologist, I'm a theorist. So there's lots of details, there's probably hundreds of quotes from refugees in these books. But what I wanted to share with you were these four concepts, because in order to write about this field, I think you have to have new ideas, new concepts to help frame the experience of millions and millions of people, those totally diverse experiences depending on where they're leaving and where they're running to and where they end up as a third country, if they do. And what about the children? And what about the women and the special issues? So I felt these four concepts would help us with that. I've also written a lot about well-being. Emily and I talked about University of Baptist Center for Wellbeing in Developing Countries, where I was visiting professor 2 or 3 times. And the Declaration of Human Rights, the Convention on the Rights of the Child, the Convention to End All Discrimination Against Women and Children, known as CEDAW. Do you all know about CEDAW? I think that was passed in 2000. The Convention to End All Discrimination Against Women and Children. Terrible name. But that is a huge deal because when women and children are discriminated against, they're hurt, their well-being is threatened in any country, whether in a camp or not, they can launch a suit or a complaint under the CEDAW umbrella and possibly get some change and some protection. So let's go to the persecution spiral first. The first thing that happens is conflict. Conflict could be an attack on a country, as Russia on Ukraine, or it could be interpolitical party conflicts. This party is fighting with that party, as it was in Congo, long-standing two civil wars, there were peace treaties, the two parties continued to cheat each other, threaten each other, kill each other, hunt each other down, and fight. And it could be not only, it could be religious conflict, it could be territorial conflict. But what happens in the persecutions spiral that refugees described to me was it's a downward, it gets worse and worse, it's a downward spiral. There's more, there's resistance, there's protest. And these slides don't seem to fit on this computer. The conflict ends up with somebody in the group that's being oppressed resisting, protesting, which tends to trigger further oppression by the people in power. Is it the party in power? Is it the government? Is it militia group? It triggers more serious and more grotesque oppression. As I mentioned, the attacks on women in front of their husband and children is a way of psychological warfare. It's a type of psychological warfare. And that greater level of oppression and persecution leads to more resistance. So what happened in Myanmar was after the initial protest resistance in villages, people started heading for the river Nam and Bangladesh to escape, because now the military, at the order of the government, were coming in and burning as many villages as they can and as many crops as they can, and killing as many women and children and males too as they can. And so that's just the escalation that means the only way to protest is to get out. So people begin, they go to a level of stronger retaliation and then escape. So in Myanmar, a small group of Rohingya males went to the border of Myanmar and Bangladesh. I was there in 2017, just before this happened. They went to the border and there's a wall and there's border guards. And they shot and killed 12 border guards, something like that. And that just let the government go absolutely mad all over the Rohingya areas. Just burned everything, killed as many people as they could. I interviewed the Rohingya in Kitchener-Waterloo in the home of a wonderful woman whose husband had left the day before to go to Myanmar to help the refugees get into Bangladesh. And that became the largest refugee camp in the world. It was 1.2 million in the first year. It's now down to 700,000 something. It's a string of camps just above the river, what's called Cox's Bazar. And as we sat down to do the focus group with elders, teenagers, mothers, fathers, the phone rang, her cell phone rang. And it was her husband from Bangladesh, who's trying to help resettle the people in Bangladesh temporarily. And he said, I have bad news for you. Your sister, who's pregnant, 8 months, I think it was, walking along the river with her 2-year-old or something, was killed by the Myanmar forces on the Myanmar side. And she fell into the river and drowned. And the child was drowned. And that's how we started the focus group. You can imagine the climate in the room. It was just unbearable. And she was so wonderful. She said, we will talk to you anyway. I thought she'll just say, go home. So that's the persecution spiral. Strategic disenfranchisement is, as an example, the story I told you before, both Myanmar and Bhutan, taking away the ordinary identity cards that allow you to work, to own a home, to rent a home, to pass from one border to another, to have education, receive healthcare. What do you have do you have a national identity card here?
Social insurance card.
You have a what? Social
Social
insurance.
insurance card.
We have social security card, we have driver's license, but many countries, especially developing countries, have national identification cards. And in those two countries, they call them white cards. And if you don't have one, you really are stateless. You are not a citizen if you can't produce that. And so in this case, the language, religion, and other factors such as, you know, your employment status or marital status, your gender, can be combined into what they call three-factor identification that essentially eliminates you from participation in your society. And so what do? And they purposely give these cards back to the people whose presence they want and desire. I didn't know any of this was going on when I was in Myanmar in 2017. People were so nice to me, people on the streets. There was a wedding going on. There was a table outside on the sidewalk filled with presents and an elderly gentleman standing in the doorway. I'm just a tourist. I was there for a week, celebrating my 75th birthday all by myself with a backpack and a stick. I had a great time. And this guy came over to me and he said, "Please come to the wedding party." I said, "Oh, no, I don't know them." "Oh, no, please, we always invite strangers in." It was lovely, and people got up, mainly older people, got up and pulled more chairs into the table, and the teenagers brought me food, made me sit with them. It was just really a sweet experience, and the bride and groom, they were gorgeous. The bride had a fabulous dress, and they were very beautiful and made up and everything. And I said, "May I take your, oh, please take many photos." You know, it was just so welcoming. And then I got home and heard what happened. And it was going on, and I had no idea because I was in the middle of the country on Lake Inle and south, and I wasn't allowed to go. They would not let me go north because they didn't, the Myanmar government didn't want to admit what was happening. So the same thing happened in Vietnam. By rehabilitation camps, re-education camps, and social isolation, firing people who were South Vietnamese if they had worked with the American military, if they had worked in the government, if they were professors in the universities, they were all excluded from participation in the new Vietnam. So that's another form of disenfranchisement. So how is the decision made to escape? Let's talk about the Vietnamese. What I was told was the women in the families, because they could see, you know, the war would be, they were doing well in the war against the North, then it would change, it would be the North doing better. And then it came to the point where everybody knew this was not going to end well. So the mothers and the grandmothers were the movers and shakers. They were the ones who sat down and said, "Well, we've got to leave." And everybody's talking about going down the river into the Gulf of Thailand and going to Malaysia or Hong Kong or maybe Thailand to escape from what's going to come next, which will be horrific. And we will be persecuted and we will be killed. And so what's the calculus? Who in the family is most likely to be the most effective, the most self-reflective, the most organized, the most reliable in taking care of other people in the family? And so I call it a calculus that was meant to maximize safety and well-being of those who left. So a mother might say, "You, Emily, are 14, but at 14 or 12, you have more sense of responsibility and obligation to your family than your 17-year-old useless brother does. So I'm sending you with your Uncle Larry, my brother, and you two will go down and you'll take the 3-year-old with you. I have to stay here and take care of my elderly parents. They're too sick to make the trip. Or I would be going with you to protect you." And so that little core group of the 14-year-old, the 3-year-old, and the uncle who's maybe 45 get on the boat, and people died like flies. The Vietnamese refugees in flight died by the thousands, and were captured when if they got to the Gulf of Thailand. They'd end up with no water, no oil, no gas for the boats, the fishing boats, and they were attacked by Thai fishermen who came aboard, took all the women and girls to their own boat, raped them all day, came back, gave them gas and water and oil and food, and sent them on their way. And so they had to accept that fact in order to survive for another 2 or 3 days out in the middle of the Gulf of Thailand, floating around aimlessly. Many, many ships just sunk. And when they got to some places, I could say Malaysia was one, there was a camp. They'd be so relieved. The boat would come up to the shore and the people would push them back into the Gulf of Thailand or whatever water it is at that point. Horrific experiences. So these people were so traumatized in spite of all their planning. But of course, millions escaped South Vietnam, well, the new Vietnam, and settled all over the world. Many, many thousands came to Canada. And the people who were interviewed in Ottawa remembered all of this very vividly because it was in the 70s and 80s. So some of the people I interviewed were in their 80s and 90s and knew exactly what was going on, or even younger. So the discussions can be held a long time before the decision actually to flee. During that time, you might also be finding, and this was true for many groups, you're trying to find guides who might be reliable. In the case of the Vietnamese, it was who can take us down the Mekong River or the creeks leading to the Mekong River, who will not kill us, take our money and our diamonds, gold, whatever we're carrying in our belts to survive later, won't drown our children. There were teenagers who, as 70-year-olds, 50-year-olds, could remember hiding in the creeks when the police came, because they were supposed to be picked up at 2 o'clock in the morning. It's pitch dark, and the police would find out that there was another bigger boat coming to get them down at the shore. So they sink into the creeks and hide their heads and drink through straws, reeds. They just pick bamboo or something off the banks and hide in the water. And some of them would drown because it was better than being killed by the police. Some of them survived. So those stories are reflections of how well you can plan. In other countries, people talked about getting guides who would take you in a van for $10,000 a person and get you out of, say, Iran, over the mountains of Turkey into Iran and Iraq, and into Turkey, where you could go to the UN office and ask for asylum and protection. And those guides often took the money and never showed up the next morning at 8 o'clock to pick you up, or they got you halfway there and abandoned you. So the strategic part of the escape is a good plan, but the reality of the escape may not. It may not pan out. And this I also heard from LGBTQ women and a couple of males who escaped from African countries, had to escape from their parents and their communities because they would be murdered if they stayed. Even their parents, in many cases, rejected them, in most cases that I heard of. And they're accepted by Canada, and they had to find a way to get here, not just with Canadian help or UN help, but informal help in their own communities to get them out of the community, out of the village, in the middle of the night, in clothes that would hide who they really were, so that they wouldn't be attacked before they even got out of the village. So all these things they bring to their experience in Canada. This is Aleppo, Syria, living in one room in all those horrible years of the Syrian war, which they said was over a few months ago and is back on track again in its own way. And the whole thing is that I felt as I interviewed people that there's this film of anxiety, and I'll talk more about that, this film of trauma and grief that refugees bring here or wherever they go. So the other part of strategic escape is my image from the movies and the news stories is that everybody in that village runs when the enemy comes in with guns and rape and tanks. And of course, women and children are always so susceptible as victims. But it's not true. It turns out that not everyone who should get out of the way of harm does so for various reasons. For example, in Syria, there, out of the pre-war population of 22 million, half were already internally displaced. But they're still living there in bombed out houses, maybe their own, maybe somebody else's down the road who did escape if their own was ruined. Of that 11 million, 6 million stayed. Even though they knew that 500 people, 500,000 people had already been killed or wounded, they stayed. They didn't want to leave their neighborhood. They didn't want to leave their own home. They didn't want to leave their relatives. This is what they said. I couldn't leave my mother. I couldn't leave my ailing father. I couldn't carry my baby far enough to make that escape. I thought they would kill us if they saw us. I'm better off living in the rubble than I am trying to make a run for it. The rest who fled the country's borders and went to asylum, sought asylum in Lebanon, Turkey, Jordan, those were terribly, terribly hard trips. A lot of people died making those trips to seek asylum. So you all know, you've heard the economic push-pull theory. And I think this is critical to understand how refugees frame their own lives and their experiences. And it's, if I leave, I can go to a better life. I can go to Canada. So many people asked for Canada first. I always ask, where did you go? Which office? Which choices were you given? And if they were given U.S., Canada, Australia, or something like that, most of them wanted Canada first because they had heard such wonderful things about Canada. So that's part of it. I'm going to go to Canada or wherever, and I'm going to have a better life for myself and my children. The second thing is, the second pull is I'll have a better chance of surviving because I don't think I have a good chance of surviving here, which is also a push. But these decisions, whichever way they go or whichever causes are there, have monumental impacts on the rest of their lives. People end up not being able ever to see their grandparents again, not ever being able to see their children again, because children are left behind, some of them. Never being able to see your best friends in life again. That's a heck of a price to pay for survival. So the decisions are not taken lightly, and there are many reasons to stay and many reasons to leave. I think we've covered that. This is a big one, being abducted into sex trafficking. Kurdish women, especially Yazidi Kurds, who have different practices and are slightly different in their religion compared to other Kurds. I interviewed them in London, Ontario. They were particularly harmed by ISIS. They were captured. The women were lined up by age and beauty and height, and The most beautiful younger ones were taken off to other towns and villages and sold as sex slaves up on platforms in the market square. One Yazidi woman said to me, they're in shock. They have no facial expression at all. The ISIS leader who took me, he got $10,000 for me. And I wanted to ask, was that a lot or a little in your mind? Was that, did he do well? Were you worth a lot, or was it only 10,000? I didn't want to press that, but, how many, there's the Vietnamese. I think I'm going backwards. Okay. That, I think I'm going way backwards. Let's try this way. I'm not used to this kind of. Okay, so what are the challenges? Having made the decision that it's a better thing to try to get out of here than to stay and tough it out. I mean, I interviewed Syrian women who were rebuilding their houses like every week. They just go pick the stones up and put them back up again. The challenges, they bring with them lots of strengths, but they also bring grief because leaving people behind. They often leave behind a generation of children who are lost to them. They can't find their children. When they finally get the word from the UN, you can go now to Canada or wherever. Those children have been acclimated to war, to violence. They know how to use AK-47s and 16s, small handguns. They're used to seeing people shot. I interviewed teenager boys from Congo and Liberia who saw their father or mother shot in front of them on the back porch. They're in the garden. They flee out the back door. The father runs out, and the other political party assassinates him right in front. Then he runs with his mother and another child to the border of Sierra Leone. They run for days, and they get to Sierra Leone, and that country has just begun its civil war, and they have to step across acres of dead bodies in a creek in order to get out of Congo. That's the kind of stuff these kids see, and they bring this with them. And those who are left behind are the ones in Congo, for example, who are now in their 20s and 30s and know how to do all this stuff. And the weapons don't come with them. The weapons don't go out of the country. The weapons stay in the country. And people know, the young kids know how to use them. All the militias that are running around Somalia, Sudan, South Sudan, Congo are using the weapons that they were using in the 1990s and 2000s. And all those children, babies, 2-year-olds, 10-year-olds, 16-year-olds are the ones who are holding them now. And it's almost impossible to stop them because they are so used to seeing people die. And they are taught as child soldiers how to use the weapons, and they're told you will never see your family again. Some of you might know some of the literature on child soldiers. I didn't interview any, but the literature says that they are told that they will never see their parents or families again, and that they will learn how to use a gun. That's a good thing. They'll have shelter and food always. And we are your family now. I actually did the focus group training for Tufts University Medical Center child soldier study, the faculty in that study who were going to go and do the interviews, and they told me what they found. So this is a cycle that just keeps replicating itself. So the core foundational challenges are the victimization, multiple victimization. Good to meet you, Michaela. That happens during war, persecution, violence in camps, the sexual predators, even in camps. The young people talk about gangs. We can't go out at night because there are gangs. The girls can't, they're supposed to go to the woods to get water or some firewood starter, little branches. And they can't go unless there's somebody, an adult, a male who will go with them because they'll be raped. The domestic violence continues as it does anywhere in the world when they're in camps. So the young people have multiple sources of anxiety and anger and hurt and feelings of not being secure or safe all the time, wherever they go. And so the trauma and the grief starts at home. It continues in the camp. The loss of family members, the grief is overwhelming. I did focus groups with Kurdish men who couldn't stop crying. They cried more than the Kurdish women. The Kurdish women were just so traumatized, they had no expression. They talked like zombies. I don't remember where my husband is. I don't know where he is. I don't know where my 12-year-old daughter is. And another one would say, I don't know where my 9-year-old son is. All just blank stares. And so that comes with them in any efforts to bring them into Canadian society and make them happy and get the jobs and the language, and they get off after a year and everything's happy and they're working and they get a house. It's all done under this blanket of anxiety, pain, grief, trauma that's unresolved. A lot of what refugee agencies do is work on grief and trauma therapy. Then they get to Canada and U.S., probably most countries, and they have to, the country pays, we pay, the government pays for their plane ride. But if your mom and dad have 6 kids and it's $3,000 a person, how many people is that? 8 people times 3 is $24,000 in debt. The minute you land, you're already in debt. That feels like this heavy leaden hat on your head to these folks. And they're put into housing right away. It's wonderful. The system works really well in this country from what I can see. But the funding, the refugees say, is newcomers at this point, we should say, is always lower during that year that you're funded than the expenses they face. I met a man from, where was he? I can't remember, it doesn't matter. But he was accepted with his wife, himself, and 5 children, and they allowed him to bring his first cousin, a woman whose husband had been killed. And she had another 4, so they had 9 children. No, there must have been 5. They had 13 people in the household. And so what happens, this is in London, Ontario. So what happens is the women who should be going to English as a second language classes can't go because they have to cook all day, wash clothes all day, make more beds all day, and clean up and wash the dishes all day. They have to prepare breakfast, lunch, and dinner. They have to send lunches with the kids to school. They have to pack those. 13 people is a lot of people to feed every day of your life. So they don't get the ESL classes. And so their integration is delayed probably by 2 years. Now the men maybe have some kind of small thing to do, but they go to ESL and the resettlement counselors really work on them to make sure they get there. But then in this particular case, the man I interviewed, he said, they're always yelling at me to come to ESL, but how can I do that? I have to get up in the morning and I have to help my wife get the kids dressed. And then they gave me a van. They found a van that holds all our children, the 9 children. And I'm so happy about that. These folks are so grateful to be here. They love Canada with all their hearts. But I'm asking them, what are your challenges? So they tell me, I have to drive the oldest boy, he's 17, he goes to high school. Then I drop off the middle school kids, and then I drop off the elementary school kids, and then I have a couple who go to preschool. And the baby stays home, being looked after by the mother, the 6-month and the 2-year-olds. And then he said, I have to go shopping for the groceries to bring home after I do the schools. So the women have something to cook. And then I have to go back and pick all the kids up again in the afternoon. The kindergarten is like 12:30, 1 o'clock, they get out. And then the earlier ones and then the later ones. And then I have to go home. And then I have to help the women clean and cook. And by the time it's class at 6 or 7 o'clock in the evening, I'm exhausted. I can't go to the resettlement agency and take ESL. So these kinds of issues, arriving in debt, not having enough money. If you had enough money, maybe you could hire someone to do all that driving around for you, and you could go and learn the language. Thirdly, learning English as a second language is very difficult. One Muslim man asked me, could you learn enough Arabic within a year in Canada to speak and write well enough to get a job in Canada, in English-speaking Canada or French-speaking? And I said, absolutely not. It's not even the same alphabet. It's a whole new tonality. And what happens is in ESL, because I interviewed ESL directors in various agencies, they're learning table, coffee, flower, tree, shirt. The Kurdish guys, experienced professional welders, they want to get a job welding. They'd make a lot of money. And they could support their family even before a year if they didn't have to speak English. But they can't get occupational and safety certification. They can't pass the test because it's not in Arabic, it's in English. So they have to wait. But when they go to ESL, they're learning book. What they need to learn is torch, fire, flame, outlet, power cord, safety words. What do you do if there's an accident in your welding shop? They need to learn the word welding. And they don't. They learn what across the board your average grandmother would need to know. This is a stove, this is a refrigerator, this is a car, this is how you call the police. Good stuff. For the average person, probably everybody should know all that, even kids. But for the welder, he can't get certified and he can't support his family after a year because he can't get the English in time. So then what they all say, we don't want to go on Ontario Works. But, this is a kind country. We don't just say, okay, now you're here, you can starve. Couldn't get a job, tough luck. Now you can go on Ontario Works. Every single person I interviewed, I don't want to go on Ontario Works. This would be a huge shame for me and my family if I had to go. And they know the word on welfare. They see it as welfare. And they don't in any way want to do that. So all of these challenges are simultaneously happening and have to be dealt with simultaneously. And I'll stop here, but just to say the trauma of war, persecution, statelessness, genocide, it all comes off the plane with every newcomer. Multiple victimization, trauma and grief, health issues for the Lhotshampa, thyroid cancers, deafness, muteness, because they've been in these camps for 24 years with bamboo poles holding up plastic and a plastic roof, and they leaked and it affected their hearing, and then they never learned to speak. And the depression that comes along with that, even before they were resettled, comes here too. They had suffered from lack of iodine and so forth. So again, those high suicide rates. So establishing employment and income stability is a major challenge. There's a disconnect between language, learning a language, and getting the credentials and certifications. And the other thing that happens is trying to rebuild a crucible of networks. Um, we talk about the crucible of the family, but it's also a crucible of networks where families from Lebanon hook up with other families from Lebanon who have come here and eventually hook up with Syrians and eventually hook up with Sudanese. And they learn from other newcomers how to work the system, how to manage, how to get the most help, where to go for it. And that takes time. The Lhotshampa were settled in Lethbridge, Alberta. The government says, oh, they're agriculturalists. We'll send them to Alberta. They grow lots of stuff in Alberta, but they put them in Lethbridge, which is where you raise cattle. And the only jobs in town were meat processing plants. And there was no bus that went all the way from where they were living in, resettled to by the agencies in Lethbridge out to meat packing plants. The bus stopped a mile short. So here it is in the middle of a horrible Alberta winter, and they have to walk the last mile. And they come from the southern part of Bhutan, which is warm, and they're raising grain. And it's not their job to do meat. So it's like a total disconnect. And of course, there's racism, the language barrier. You don't need to read that right now. I'll give you some handouts if you'd like. And yet, after 10 years, refugees report at lower than average income compared to other Canadians. And that, you know, I would expect that. It's all to do with credentialing and certifications and language and not being able to take the jobs that you're qualified for, like a welder or a doctor or a nurse. Nonetheless, I've got to run through this pretty quick. Am I going backwards again? No, I think that's okay. The Liberians, for example, do a great thing in Hamilton. They started this, they did fundraising and started Empowerment Squared, and it's a place where Liberians, newcomers and oldcomers can come and meet each other. Well, that's strategic resettlement because there's an older Liberian refugee group, much older, years, decades older than the current one. And they help each other build a community and at the same time earned enough money through fundraising to build a new library in Monrovia to try to help things better in Liberia, become better in Liberia. So it's encouraging, but uneven, the resettlement success rates. Some people never really make it. In fact, some people take their own life. Some end up in total, funk, sitting at home, not going out. They're in counseling of different kinds, but for the most part, they don't resettle well. Depends on how well the agencies do. I'm very impressed by every agency I went to. Some of them are churches. The Vietnamese were resettled by a Catholic church in Ottawa. And a lot came to Toronto, same experience. How long they lived in limbo. If you've lived in limbo over, I think, 4 or 5 years, you're probably destined to not make a great resettlement. It would be like climbing a mountain again. The extent of trauma and culture shock, the level of incompatibility of your native tongue with the languages you encounter here, and how consistent and supportive governments are. And we have to remember in Canada, we have a very strong private sector effort to resettle refugees under a different scheme. But again, Canada's a great country. So I leave you with some questions to ponder, and we can discuss them a little here. An hour and a half isn't quite enough time to tackle such a major issue, but what are the hallmarks of it? What would they be if you saw a successful integration pattern into a host community? How could the Canadian refugee system be improved? I've worked in both books. I talk a lot about policy and human rights and the whole UN global agreement system and what needs to be changed. Slowly, they have included refugees in these documents, but nobody's paying attention to it. People are still thinking about normal people, not people in camps or people in urban housing, and what policies could or should be reworked. And then I've already touched on this, but the people who flee the chaos of war have the capacity, even if they were children, to replicate it. And so it's a hidden phenomenon. And there are women all over the world who are calling for an end to violence and for peace. And their voices are loud and mostly ignored. And this is a photo I took in Bolivia years and years ago. And I leave you with this thought that most children do not have a voice. And they are almost, 40% women, children are more than half of all refugees. And so the little kids are probably 30%. Most children don't have a voice, but their eyes ask us, tell us to make good choices for them, to speak for them. And I'd love your comments. So can we have some conversation, and please, those of you who are on the Zoom call, we're able to see you now. And we would love to hear from you.